Before headlines, before printed pages, and long before a morning paper landed on a doorstep, Europe was already full of news. Kings rose and fell, wars began and ended, prices changed, ships arrived, rumors traveled, and entire cities reacted, often within days, sometimes within hours. But how did people know? Who carried the information? And why did some messages spread like wildfire while others vanished without a trace? In this video, we uncover the quiet, human systems that moved news across Europe without newspapers, through voices, roads, memory, repetition, and trust. From crowded marketplaces to long-distance trade routes, from handwritten notes to spoken reports, this is the forgotten infrastructure of communication that shaped daily life for centuries. If you enjoy calm, deeply researched history that reveals how ordinary people once understood their world, like the video, subscribe for more slow history, and leave a comment telling us what surprises you most about life before modern media. Now, let's begin. Long before printed newspapers appeared as a regular feature of European life, communication relied on something far older and far more personal: people themselves. News did not exist as a fixed object that could be picked up, folded, or archived. It lived in voices, in movement, in repetition, and in memory. To understand how information traveled across Europe without newspapers, we must first let go of modern expectations. There were no daily editions, no headlines, no universal sense of breaking news. Instead, there was a constant, uneven flow of information, shaped by geography, habit, trust, and human presence. In medieval and early modern Europe, news was not something people searched for. It was something they encountered. Information arrived while buying bread, while traveling a road, while hosting a guest, or while waiting in line at a city gate. Communication depended on circulation of people, goods, letters, and stories. The same road that carried wool or grain also carried information. The same ship that brought spices or cloth also brought reports from distant ports. News moved because people moved, and Europe was far less static than it often appears in retrospect. Most Europeans lived within a small radius of their birthplace, but even small distances mattered. A traveler walking from one town to the next could carry weeks' worth of updates simply by answering questions. Where had he come from? What was happening there? Were prices rising or falling? Had any new laws been announced? Were roads safe and inns open? These questions were not casual. They were practical, and the answers influenced decisions large and small. Information was valuable because it helped people orient themselves in a world where uncertainty was a daily reality. Markets were among the most important communication hubs. On market days, villages and towns filled with farmers, merchants, porters, craftsmen, and visitors from surrounding regions. These gatherings created a dense web of conversation. While goods were displayed and exchanged, news was traded just as actively. A seller from another town might mention a new tax, a shortage, or a change in demand. A buyer might share rumors heard along the road. Even exaggeration played a role. Stories were repeated, reshaped, and refined through discussion, often becoming clearer as multiple accounts overlapped. What made markets so effective was not just the number of people present, but their diversity. A single marketplace could connect multiple social layers: rural and urban, wealthy and modest, local and foreign. Each person carried a slightly different version of events, and through conversation, these versions were compared. Contradictions were noticed. Patterns emerged. In this way, markets functioned as informal editorial spaces, where credibility was tested not through written proof, but through consistency and reputation. Travelers were another essential component of this system. Journeys took time, and during that time, travelers gathered information almost without trying. They stayed at inns, shared meals, and rested in communal spaces. Inns, in particular, played a crucial role in communication. They were places where strangers were expected to speak. A traveler's account of distant places was often the only source of external information for local residents. Innkeepers became unofficial collectors of news, hearing the same reports repeated by different guests and forming their own sense of what was reliable. Because travel was slower, news traveled in layers rather than waves. Information moved outward from its point of origin, growing less precise with distance, but still recognizable. A change announced in one city might be known in nearby towns within days, in distant regions within weeks, and in remote areas months later. The delay did not make the information useless. On the contrary, people understood these delays and adjusted their expectations accordingly. The concept of outdated news had a different meaning when life itself moved at a slower pace. Letters added another dimension to communication. Long before newspapers, written correspondence existed as a parallel system of information exchange. Letters were not private in the modern sense. They were often read aloud, shared among family members, neighbors, or colleagues. A single letter could inform dozens of people. Merchants, officials, scholars, and city leaders maintained wide networks of correspondence, using letters to share updates, requests, and observations. These networks formed early information highways, connecting cities across regions and borders. However, letters were expensive and required literacy, which limited their reach. This limitation gave spoken communication even greater importance. For most people, listening was the primary way of learning about the world beyond their immediate surroundings. Memory, therefore, became a crucial skill. People developed techniques to remember key details, names, places, dates, outcomes. Repetition reinforced accuracy. A story heard many times from different sources gained authority. In this way, collective memory functioned as a stabilizing force in an otherwise fluid system. Public announcements also played a role. Town criers, messengers, and officials delivered official information aloud in public spaces. These announcements were often repeated at set locations and times to ensure that as many people as possible heard them. While this method did not cover all types of news, it ensured that important decisions, regulations, or schedules were widely known. The spoken word, delivered clearly and publicly, carried weight precisely because it could be witnessed and remembered by many at once. Trust was the invisible structure holding this entire system together. Without printed verification, people relied on social judgment. Who was speaking? What was their reputation? Had they been reliable before? A merchant known for honesty carried more influence than a stranger. A traveler who could answer detailed follow-up questions was taken more seriously than one who spoke vaguely. Over time, communities developed a shared sense of whose words mattered. It is important to understand that rumor was not simply false information. It was often incomplete information. In a world without centralized media, uncertainty was unavoidable. People learned to live with partial knowledge, adjusting their behavior as more details emerged. This flexibility made the communication system resilient. Even when specific details were unclear, the general direction of events could still be understood. Geography shaped communication in powerful ways. Rivers, roads, and ports acted as channels through which news flowed more quickly. Coastal regions often received information faster due to maritime connections. Inland areas relied more heavily on overland routes, which could be seasonal. Mountain regions developed tighter local networks, with information circulating intensely within smaller areas. These differences meant that Europe did not share a single information timeline. Each region experienced events through its own rhythm of communication. Despite these differences, Europe was far from isolated. Trade networks connected distant regions, and with them came information. A merchant traveling from Italy to the Low Countries might carry news across thousands of kilometers, passing it on step by step. By the time the information reached its final destination, it might have changed in tone or emphasis, but its core often remained intact. The system worked not because it was precise, but because it was continuous. What emerges from this picture is a form of communication that feels unfamiliar, yet deeply human. It depended on conversation, attention, memory, and movement. It required patience and participation. Everyone played a role, whether by listening, repeating, questioning, or observing. News was not consumed, it was shared. As we move forward, it becomes clear that the absence of newspapers did not mean the absence of awareness. On the contrary, people were often highly attuned to their surroundings and to broader developments. The methods were slower, but the engagement was active. Understanding this helps us see early European society not as uninformed or passive, but as operating within a different, remarkably effective information environment. This foundation, built on people, places, and spoken exchange, set the stage for all later developments in communication. Before print transformed news into a physical product, It was already alive in Europe's streets, roads, and voices, quietly shaping decisions and perceptions every single day. If people were the carriers of news, then places were the amplifiers. Communication in pre-newspaper Europe did not spread evenly across the landscape. It gathered, intensified, and accelerated in specific locations where movement, waiting, and exchange naturally occurred. These places, markets, inns, ports, crossroads, city gates, workshops, and even queues, formed a quiet but powerful communication infrastructure. News did not simply pass through them. It lingered, echoed, and multiplied. The marketplace was the most visible and consistent of these hubs. Markets were not occasional events, but regular rhythms of life. Weekly markets, seasonal fairs, and annual gatherings structured time as much as they structured trade. People planned journeys around them. Entire regions synchronized their movement to these dates. As a result, markets concentrated information in ways few other spaces could. Someone arriving early brought fresh reports. Someone leaving late carried accumulated updates onward. A single market day could compress weeks of scattered information into a few hours of intense exchange. What made marketplaces particularly effective was not just density, but repetition. The same people returned week after week. This created continuity. A rumor heard one week could be confirmed or corrected the next. If a trader exaggerated prices or conditions, others would challenge the claim. Over time, markets developed an internal logic of credibility. Certain stalls became known not only for goods, but for reliable information. Conversations followed predictable paths: greetings, questions about travel, comments on weather or harvests, and then, almost inevitably, updates from elsewhere. Inns worked in a similar but more focused way. While markets were noisy and expansive, inns were contained and intimate. Travelers stayed overnight, sometimes for several days, especially when roads were poor or schedules misaligned. Evenings created long stretches of shared time. Meals were taken together. Stories were exchanged not quickly, but slowly, often repeated for new listeners. This repetition strengthened memory and detail. By morning, several people might carry the same story onward, each with slight variations but a shared core. Innkeepers occupied a unique position. They heard everything and spoke selectively. Their livelihood depended on trust, safety, and reputation. As a result, they became informal filters of information. They learned which reports were worth passing on and which were best treated with caution. Over years, some innkeepers developed wide knowledge of regional patterns, trade conditions, seasonal movements, and recurring events. Travelers often asked them directly for updates before setting out, treating their judgment as a practical guide. Ports added another layer entirely. Maritime travel connected distant regions more efficiently than overland routes, and ports became gateways of long-distance information. Ships did not arrive quietly. Their appearance was noticed, discussed, and anticipated. Crews brought news not only from the last port, but from several stops along the way. Dock workers, merchants, customs officials, and local residents all participated in absorbing and redistributing this information. Within hours of arrival, news from faraway places could circulate throughout a coastal city. Ports also created a distinctive communication rhythm. Periods of waiting were followed by bursts of information. When ships were delayed, speculation grew. When they finally arrived, conversation intensified. People learned to read signs, flags, cargo types, crew behavior. These observations supplemented spoken reports. Communication here was not only verbal, but observational. Even silence could convey meaning. City gates served a similar function inland. Anyone entering or leaving a walled town passed through controlled points. Guards asked questions. Travelers answered. Waiting lines formed. These pauses became opportunities for conversation. People compared destinations, discussed road conditions, and exchanged updates. City gates were places of verification. A traveler's story might be questioned more closely here, especially if officials were listening. This scrutiny encouraged clarity and consistency, reinforcing the reliability of information that passed through. Workshops and guild spaces played a quieter but steady role. Craftsmen often worked communally or in open spaces. Customers came and went. Apprentices moved between masters. Journeymen traveled from town to town, carrying not only skills but stories. These movements created professional communication networks that crossed regional boundaries. News related to trade, demand, regulation, or technique moved quickly within these circles. Even broader events were interpreted through the lens of work. How would this affect materials, prices, or opportunities? Crossroads deserve special attention. These were not merely physical intersections, but temporal ones. People paused, adjusted plans, and decided directions. Crossroads often had inns, shrines, or markers, making them natural meeting points. News exchanged here tended to be concise and practical. Which road was best? Which town was busy? Which route should be avoided? Over time, crossroads accumulated reputations as reliable points of exchange, especially in rural areas where markets were less frequent. Even queues became communication spaces. Waiting created conversation. Whether waiting to enter a town, receive goods, or conduct business, people talked. Waiting equalized status temporarily. Those standing together shared time, and time invited exchange. News passed casually, often beginning with small talk and expanding into broader updates. These moments were brief but frequent, creating countless micro-exchanges that sustained the wider network. What unified all these places was the presence of time. Communication required time spent together. Unlike written media, which could be consumed privately and quickly, spoken news needed shared moments. This made information inherently social. News did not simply inform, it connected. It created shared understanding and collective orientation. People did not just learn what had happened, they learned how others reacted to it. The physical layout of European towns and cities reinforced this pattern. Narrow streets, central squares, and mixed-use spaces brought people into repeated contact. Urban design unintentionally supported communication density. Information circulated not because of centralized planning, but because daily life created constant intersections. Even silence played a role. Not hearing news where one expected it could signal change or delay. Seasonality added another dimension. Winter slowed movement, compressing communication into fewer places. Inns became more important. Summer expanded networks as travel increased. Harvest seasons brought temporary populations together, intensifying exchange. Over years, people learned these rhythms and adjusted expectations accordingly. Communication was not static, it breathed with the calendar. Importantly, these hubs did not merely transmit information, they shaped it. The same news told in a market might emphasize prices and supply. Told in an inn, it might focus on journeys and encounters. Told at a port, it might highlight distance and timing. Context influenced content. This did not distort information so much as adapt it. News became meaningful because it was framed for the listener's needs. Authority in these spaces was situational. A merchant might dominate conversation in a market, while a seasoned traveler held attention in an inn. In a workshop, experience mattered more than origin. This fluid authority allowed multiple perspectives to coexist. It also prevented any single narrative from becoming absolute. Contradictions were not failures of the system. They were part of its balancing mechanism. Over time, repeated circulation created familiarity. People recognized recurring stories and themes. They developed an intuitive sense of scale. What was local, what was regional, what was distant. Even without maps or printed summaries, they formed mental geographies of information flow. This awareness guided decisions, from when to travel to whom to trust. In this way, physical places acted as living pages, written and rewritten daily by human interaction. They stored information temporarily, released it through conversation, and refreshed it through repetition. The absence of newspapers did not leave a vacuum. It created a communication environment that was slower, more communal, and deeply embedded in everyday life. As Europe continued to grow more interconnected, these hubs became even more important. They prepared society for later developments by establishing habits of listening, questioning, and sharing. Long before news was printed, it was already structured by place. Beyond places and gatherings, the true connective tissue of European communication lay in movement itself. Roads, rivers, sea lanes, and the people who traveled them formed continuous channels through which information flowed. News did not leap from city to city. It walked, rode, floated, and sailed. The pace of communication was inseparable from the pace of travel, and understanding how news spread without newspapers requires understanding how Europe moved. Overland travel was slow by modern standards, but it was steady and surprisingly regular. Well-established routes connected major towns, markets, and political centers. These roads were not empty lines on a map. They were lived spaces shaped by generations of use. Merchants, messengers, pilgrims, craftsmen, officials, and laborers shared them. Each traveler carried personal experiences and collected new information along the way, adding to the overall flow of news. Messengers played a particularly important role. Long before organized postal systems became widespread, messengers operated through informal arrangements. Cities, noble households, merchant companies, and guilds employed trusted individuals to carry messages. These messengers did more than deliver written notes. They remembered spoken instructions, observed conditions, and answered questions upon arrival. Their value lay as much in what they could report verbally as in what they carried in writing. Because messengers often traveled the same routes repeatedly, they became familiar figures. People recognized them, questioned them, and sometimes followed their movements closely. A messenger's arrival could signal importance. Even without knowing the content of a message, people inferred significance from urgency, frequency, or timing. In this way, the act of movement itself communicated meaning. Rivers were among the most efficient communication channels. Transport by water was faster and less physically demanding than overland travel. Major rivers like the Rhine, Danube, Seine, and Thames linked inland regions to coastal centers. Barges and boats moved goods and people, and with them, news. River towns became information relay points, where reports from upstream and downstream were exchanged and compared. River travel also created predictable schedules. Boats departed and arrived according to water levels and seasons. These patterns allowed people to anticipate information flow. A delay in river traffic could signal flooding, drought, or political disruption upstream. Thus, absence of news was itself informative. People learned to read the rhythm of movement as carefully as its content. Sea lanes extended these networks dramatically. Maritime routes connected Europe internally and externally, linking distant regions through chains of ports. News from abroad often entered Europe through coastal cities, spreading inward along trade routes. Sailors carried stories shaped by long journeys and diverse encounters. Their accounts blended observation with interpretation, but they were often the first source of information about distant events. Seafaring communication required trust. Journeys were long, and verification was difficult. Yet repeated patterns built credibility. If multiple ships reported similar conditions or events, confidence increased. Ports acted as verification hubs, where overlapping accounts reinforced or corrected each other. Over time, maritime communities developed strong internal standards for assessing information based on experience rather than documentation. Seasonality heavily influenced movement. Winter slowed travel, especially overland. Roads became difficult, passes closed, and journeys were postponed. This did not stop communication, but it altered its shape. During these months, news accumulated locally, circulating within smaller areas. When travel resumed in spring, information moved outward in larger bursts, catching up with delayed regions. This created cycles of compression and release in the information flow. Journeymen exemplified the role of movement in communication. These skilled workers traveled between towns to gain experience. Their journeys were long and social. They stayed with other craftsmen, shared meals, and discussed conditions across regions. Because they moved within professional networks, their information was often detailed and practical. They understood local differences and conveyed them accurately, making them valuable sources of news within their communities. Pilgrims also contributed, though their journeys followed different patterns. Traveling to specific destinations, they crossed wide territories and interacted with diverse populations. Along the way, they gathered stories and shared them. Their reports often focused on conditions along routes, safety, hospitality, crowd sizes. Even without official roles, their movement created bridges between otherwise distant areas. Officials and envoys traveled with purpose and authority. Their presence alone communicated significance. When an envoy arrived, people paid attention, even if details were scarce. These figures often stayed in prominent locations, attracting conversation. Their movements were noted and discussed, creating layers of speculation that preceded and followed their visits. In this way, Movement generated anticipation and interpretation. Importantly, not all communication required long journeys. Short-distance travel created dense local networks. Daily movement between villages and nearby towns ensured constant circulation of information. People commuting for work, trade, or social obligations formed overlapping routes that reinforced awareness. News spread incrementally, step by step, creating a mosaic of shared understanding across regions. The physical effort of travel influenced how information was remembered and told. Long journeys encouraged narrative structure. Travelers organized their accounts around places, obstacles, and encounters. This storytelling made information memorable. A report framed as a journey was easier to recall and repeat than a list of facts. Thus, the form of communication adapted to the conditions of movement. Danger and uncertainty also shaped communication. Travelers learned to assess risk through shared knowledge. Which roads were safe? Which areas should be avoided? Such information was constantly updated through conversation. Even without formal warnings, communities maintained dynamic maps of safety based on recent reports. This practical knowledge spread efficiently because it mattered immediately. Movement created social bonds. People who traveled together shared experiences and trusted each other more quickly. These bonds enhanced information exchange. A companion's report carried more weight than a stranger's. Over time, these traveling relationships formed informal networks that extended across regions. Trust traveled with people, strengthening communication channels. Crucially, movement ensured redundancy. News did not rely on a single route or messenger. Multiple paths carried similar information. This redundancy increased resilience. If one route was blocked, others continued. If one report was flawed, others corrected it. The system did not aim for speed alone, it aimed for continuity. By tying communication to movement, Europe developed an information system that mirrored its physical geography. Hills, rivers, roads, and ports shaped not only trade and travel, but awareness. News moved at the speed of footsteps, hooves, oars, and wind. It was shaped by fatigue, weather, and time. Yet within these constraints, it reached remarkably far. Understanding this helps us see that communication without newspapers was not primitive. It was adaptive. It used what was available: bodies, routes, habits, and memory. Movement was not a barrier to information. It was the medium itself. As we continue, we will see how this moving system interacted with authority, power, and intentional control, how information was guided, restricted, or amplified long before print transformed its form. While much of Europe's news traveled organically through people, places, and movement, not all communication was accidental or uncontrolled. Long before newspapers, authorities understood the power of information and made deliberate efforts to guide it. Cities, rulers, councils, and institutions developed methods to announce decisions, shape understanding, and manage uncertainty. These practices did not replace informal communication. They interacted with it, sometimes reinforcing it, sometimes competing with it. Together, they formed a layered information environment where official voices and everyday voices constantly overlapped. Public announcements were one of the most visible tools of intentional communication. Town criers, heralds, and messengers were tasked with delivering official information aloud in public spaces. Their role was not to inform everyone individually, but to create a shared moment of hearing. The message mattered, but so did the act of public delivery. When an announcement was made in a square or near a market, it gained authority through visibility. People heard it together, remembered it together, and discussed it together afterward. These announcements followed specific conventions. They were delivered at predictable locations and times, often repeated to ensure wide reach. Language was carefully chosen to be clear and memorable. Announcements avoided unnecessary detail, focusing instead on outcomes, dates, and obligations. This simplicity helped ensure that the message survived repetition. People did not need to remember exact phrasing. They needed to remember what changed and what was expected. Crucially, public announcements did not end communication. They began it. Once an official message was heard, it entered the informal network. People repeated it, explained it, questioned it, and interpreted it. In doing so, they localized the information. A new regulation meant different things to different people, and conversation allowed those implications to be explored. Authority spoke once, society spoke continuously. Written notices also existed, though their role was different from modern print. Notices were posted in public places, but they assumed an audience that would read aloud to others. Literacy was uneven, but reading was often communal. A posted notice became a focal point for gathering. Someone who could read would attract listeners. The act of reading transformed the written word back into speech, re-entering the oral system. Official messengers operated alongside public announcements. These individuals carried instructions, updates, or requests between centers of power and local authorities. Their journeys were purposeful and often urgent. Unlike casual travelers, they were expected to deliver information accurately and discreetly. However, their presence was rarely invisible. Locals noticed them, speculated about their mission, and anticipated outcomes. Even silence created conversation. City councils and courts played a subtle role in information management. Proceedings were often public or semi-public. Observers attended sessions, listened to debates, and carried impressions outward. Not everything was formally announced, but much was indirectly communicated through presence and participation. A crowded council meeting signaled importance. A postponed decision suggested uncertainty. People learned to read these signs and incorporate them into their understanding of events. Ceremony itself was a form of communication. Processions, proclamations, and public gatherings conveyed messages through structure and repetition. Even without explicit explanation, people understood that such events marked change. Ceremony made information visible and memorable. It anchored abstract decisions in physical experience. This mattered in a world where memory was the primary archive. Authorities also relied on trusted intermediaries. Guild leaders, elders, and local officials acted as translators between centralized decisions and everyday life. These figures explained policies, answered questions, and reported reactions upward. Their role was not merely administrative, it was communicative. They softened messages, clarified expectations, and adapted language to local context. In doing so, they ensured that official information could actually function. Control of information, however, was never absolute. Informal networks moved faster than official ones and often filled gaps before announcements arrived. Rumor thrived in uncertainty. Authorities understood this and sometimes acted strategically, releasing partial information to shape conversation. Timing mattered. An early announcement could calm speculation. A delayed one could allow multiple narratives to form. Suppression of information was also a tool, though an imperfect one. Limiting announcements or restricting messengers could slow communication, but it could not stop it entirely. Silence itself became news. When people expected information and did not receive it, they drew conclusions. Absence was interpreted, discussed, and often exaggerated. Authorities had to balance secrecy with credibility, knowing that too much silence could undermine trust. Trust, again, was central. Official communication relied on the belief that authority had the right and ability to speak truthfully. When that belief weakened, informal networks gained strength. People compared official messages with lived experience and traveler reports. Discrepancies were noted. Over time, communities developed nuanced views of authority, trusting some messages while questioning others. Interestingly, official and unofficial communication often reinforced each other. An announcement might confirm what people already suspected through informal channels. In such cases, authority gained legitimacy by aligning with shared understanding. Conversely, informal reports could prepare people for official decisions, reducing shock and resistance. The system functioned best when both layers interacted rather than competed. Language choice mattered deeply. Authorities used formal phrasing, ritual language, and established formulas. These choices signaled seriousness and continuity. People recognized these patterns and responded accordingly. Even without full comprehension, tone and structure conveyed meaning. Formal language distinguished official information from everyday talk, helping listeners categorize what they heard. Geography again influenced effectiveness. In dense urban areas, announcements reached many quickly. In rural regions, communication relied more heavily on intermediaries and repetition. Messages traveled outward through layers of authority and conversation. Each layer adapted the information slightly, ensuring relevance while maintaining core meaning. Importantly, people were not passive recipients. They actively engaged with official communication. They asked questions, sought clarification, and evaluated consequences. Information became meaningful through use. A new rule mattered because of how it affected daily routines. Discussion grounded abstract authority in practical reality. This dynamic created a feedback loop. Authorities observed public reaction through intermediaries and adjusted future communication accordingly. Over time, this interaction shaped how information was delivered. Messages became clearer, timing improved, and repetition increased. The system evolved not through theory, but through lived experience. What emerges is a picture of intentional communication embedded within a broader, organic network. Authority did not replace everyday exchange, it depended on it. Official messages gained power only when they entered conversation, memory, and movement. Without newspapers, communication was not centralized in print, but distributed across people and practices. As we move forward, we will explore how written correspondence expanded these systems further, creating durable networks that stretched across Europe long before mass print transformed the scale of communication. Long before newspapers created a shared public record, Europe already possessed something quieter but remarkably powerful: networks of written correspondence. Letters did not replace spoken communication, they extended it. They allowed information to travel farther, persist longer, and move with greater intentionality. Yet letters were never isolated objects. They existed within a social ecosystem of reading aloud, copying, summarizing, and retelling. To understand how news spread across Europe without newspapers, we must understand how letters functioned not as private messages, but as engines of collective awareness. Writing a letter was an act of effort. Materials were costly, time was limited, and delivery was uncertain. As a result, letters were written with purpose. They often carried more than one message at once: practical updates, observations, requests, and commentary. A single letter might include information about prices, political developments, travel conditions, and personal impressions. Writers understood that their words might be shared beyond the original recipient, and many wrote with this broader audience in mind. Letters moved through overlapping networks rather than fixed routes. Merchants exchanged correspondence with partners across regions. City officials wrote to counterparts in other towns. Scholars maintained long-distance intellectual relationships. Noble households communicated with allies and representatives. These networks intersected constantly. A merchant might share news learned from a city official's letter. A scholar might pass along information received from a traveler. Letters were not endpoints, they were nodes. One of the most important features of letter-based communication was its durability. Spoken news faded unless repeated. Letters, however, could be saved, reread, and consulted. They allowed information to accumulate. Over time, collections of correspondence became informal archives, preserving sequences of events and patterns of change. This accumulation created continuity, something spoken communication struggled to maintain over long periods. Yet letters were rarely silent. Reading was often a communal act. Literacy was uneven, but that did not limit access to written information. A person who could read became a conduit for many others. Letters were read aloud in homes, workshops, inns, and councils. Listeners asked questions. The reader explained context. The written word was translated back into speech, re-entering the oral system with added authority. This practice blurred the line between written and spoken news. A letter might travel hundreds of kilometers, then be absorbed into local conversation within minutes. Its phrasing influenced how the story was told. Certain expressions or emphases survived repetition, shaping interpretation. In this way, letters acted as stabilizing anchors in a fluid information environment. Copying further extended their reach. Important letters were sometimes transcribed by hand and sent onward. Copies could circulate independently of the original, reaching new audiences. Even summaries mattered. A person might not reproduce a letter word for word, but convey its key points. This practice created layers of transmission, each adapting the information slightly while preserving its core. Merchant correspondence was especially influential. Trade depended on timely information. Prices, supply conditions, demand shifts, and transport risks all required awareness beyond local markets. Merchants wrote frequently and expected detailed replies. Their letters often contained precise observations, making them valuable sources of news. Because trade networks spanned large areas, merchant correspondence linked distant regions into shared informational spheres. Importantly, merchant letters were not purely economic. They often included broader observations, political changes, weather patterns, disruptions along routes. These details mattered because they affected business, but they also informed wider understanding. A merchant might mention unrest not as commentary, but as an explanation for delays. Listeners, however, absorbed the information regardless of intent. City administrations also relied heavily on correspondence. Towns communicated with neighboring cities, regional authorities, and representatives. These letters addressed legal matters, alliances, disputes, and coordination. They created an interurban dialogue that allowed cities to align expectations and responses. News circulated through these channels with a formal tone, but it did not remain confined to official circles. Clerks, messengers, and intermediaries carried impressions outward. Scholars formed another layer of correspondence-based communication. Intellectual exchange required written language, and scholars maintained extensive networks across Europe. Their letters discussed texts, ideas, and observations. While this might seem removed from everyday news, it often included references to current events. Scholars commented on political shifts, institutional changes, and social conditions, embedding news within intellectual discourse. These scholarly networks were slow but wide-reaching. A letter might take weeks or months to arrive, but once received, it could influence discussion for years. Ideas and information spread gradually, accumulating authority through repetition and citation. This process fostered a long-term awareness of change rather than immediate reaction. Noble households operated their own correspondence systems. Estates, representatives, and allies exchanged letters regularly. These communications managed resources, relationships, and influence. News was integral to these exchanges. Information about marriages, alliances, disputes, and appointments circulated through letters before becoming widely known. Servants, clerks, and visitors absorbed this information and carried it onward. Messengers were central to this system. Carrying letters was not a mechanical task. Messengers often delivered verbal explanations alongside written messages. They answered questions, clarified intentions, and reported reactions. Their presence added context. A letter delivered without explanation might be ambiguous. A letter delivered with commentary became clearer and more persuasive. Delivery itself communicated meaning. Speed mattered. An urgent letter signaled importance. Multiple letters arriving in close succession suggested escalation. Delays created anxiety and speculation. People learned to interpret these signals intuitively. Communication was not only about content, but about timing and frequency. Letters also allowed for selective communication. Unlike public announcements, letters could be directed to specific individuals or groups. This selectivity enabled targeted information flow. Not everyone needed to know everything, yet selective communication often leaked. Recipients shared information when it suited them. Boundaries between private and public were porous. Language choice within letters reflected awareness of this permeability. Writers balanced clarity with caution. They avoided unnecessary detail when sensitivity mattered. They used established formulas to convey seriousness or urgency. These conventions were widely understood. Even listeners who heard letters read aloud recognized these signals and interpreted them accordingly. Trust again played a central role. The value of a letter depended on the credibility of its sender. Networks were built on reputation. A correspondent known for accuracy carried influence beyond their immediate circle. Conversely, unreliable writers lost standing. Over time, these reputational dynamics shaped which letters were shared widely and which were treated cautiously. Letters also enabled correction. If spoken rumors circulated inaccurately, a letter could clarify events. Written accounts provided reference points. People compared what they heard with what was written. Discrepancies prompted discussion and reevaluation. This capacity for correction enhanced the overall resilience of the communication system. Importantly, letters did not create a unified public opinion. They created overlapping spheres of awareness. Different networks emphasized different information. Merchants focused on trade-related developments. Officials emphasized governance. Scholars highlighted intellectual trends. Noble households tracked alliances and influence. These spheres intersected but did not merge completely. Yet over time, repeated intersections created shared understanding. A political change mentioned in merchant letters, discussed in councils, and referenced in scholarly correspondence gained prominence. Multiple confirmations across networks reinforced credibility. This convergence functioned much like later media consensus, but without central coordination. Geography shaped correspondence patterns. Regions with dense networks exchanged information more frequently. Peripheral areas received fewer letters, but still participated indirectly through shared reading and retelling. The uneven distribution of correspondence did not exclude participation. It shaped perspective. People understood their place within the flow. The physicality of letters mattered as well. Seals, handwriting, and materials conveyed status and authenticity. Listeners might not see the letter, but readers described these features. A well-sealed letter suggested authority. A hurried hand suggested urgency. These details enriched interpretation. Over decades, correspondence networks grew more complex and reliable. They laid the groundwork for later systems of communication. When newspapers eventually emerged, they did not replace letters immediately. Instead, they integrated into existing habits of reading, sharing, and discussing. The success of print depended on practices already established through correspondence. What letters demonstrate most clearly is that communication without newspapers was not accidental or unsophisticated. It was intentional, layered, and adaptive. People invested time and resources into maintaining awareness beyond their immediate surroundings. They understood that information was power, security, and opportunity. By combining durability with flexibility, correspondence networks bridged distances that spoken communication alone could not. They created continuity across time and space. They allowed Europe to function as an interconnected information environment long before mass print. As we move forward, we will explore how memory, repetition, and collective judgment worked alongside these written systems. How people decided what to believe, what to repeat, and what to ignore in a world where information was abundant but verification was personal. In a world without newspapers, credibility was not printed at the top of a page. It had to be earned, tested, and reaffirmed through human judgment. News existed everywhere, but belief was selective. People did not accept information automatically. They evaluated it constantly. Memory, repetition, comparison, and social trust formed the invisible mechanisms that determined which stories endured and which faded away. Understanding how Europeans decided what to believe is essential to understanding how communication functioned without centralized media. Memory was the first filter. In an oral-dominant environment, information that could not be remembered could not survive. This simple fact shaped how news was told. Stories were structured to be memorable. They followed journeys, sequences, or cause and effect patterns. Names of places mattered more than precise dates. Outcomes mattered more than procedural detail. Information that fit into existing mental frameworks was easier to recall and more likely to be repeated. Repetition strengthened memory and credibility simultaneously. Hearing the same account from different people increased confidence in its accuracy. Even when details varied, a shared core suggested reliability. Communities became accustomed to comparing versions. Differences were discussed openly. This comparison process was not formal, but it was rigorous. Over time, people learned which variations were normal and which signaled distortion. Social position influenced credibility, but it did not determine it absolutely. A person's occupation, experience, and reputation mattered more than status alone. A traveler who had recently come from a place carried more authority about that place than a local official who had not left town. A merchant familiar with regional trade patterns was trusted on economic matters. Expertise was situational. People listened differently depending on the topic. This situational trust created a flexible hierarchy of voices. No single group controlled information. Instead, authority shifted depending on context. This prevented total domination of narrative while still allowing expertise to guide understanding. People became skilled listeners, adjusting their expectations based on who was speaking and why. Collective judgment played a central role. News was rarely processed in isolation. People discussed what they heard with others. Conversation refined understanding. Questions exposed weaknesses. Clarifications improved accuracy. Even skepticism contributed to stability by preventing premature conclusions. Doubt was not a flaw in the system, it was a feature. Rumor, often misunderstood, was an essential part of this environment. Rumor did not mean fabrication. It meant information in transition. Early reports were incomplete by nature. People recognized this and treated rumor as provisional. As more reports arrived, rumor evolved into accepted understanding or was discarded. The process was dynamic and continuous. Importantly, people remembered sources as well as content. Who said this mattered? Memory included context, where the information was heard, under what circumstances, and alongside which other reports. This contextual memory allowed people to weigh information later. A claim heard once from an unknown traveler carried less weight than a report heard repeatedly from known contacts. Time also acted as a filter. Information that remained relevant across weeks or months gained legitimacy. Stories that changed constantly lost credibility. Stability mattered. This temporal dimension encouraged patience. Immediate reaction was less important than sustained consistency. Communities developed shared standards without formal rules. Certain claims required stronger confirmation. Others were accepted more easily. Practical information, such as road conditions or market changes, was evaluated quickly because consequences were immediate. Broader developments were assessed more cautiously. This differentiation prevented overload and allowed attention to be allocated effectively. Memory was not static. It was reinforced through use. Information that influenced decisions was remembered better. A report that affected travel plans or prices stayed active in conversation. In contrast, abstract details faded. This natural selection ensured that communication remained tied to lived experience. Storytelling played a crucial role in retention. Narratives were easier to remember than lists. Travelers described routes, encounters, and sequences. These stories embedded facts within movement. Even listeners who could not recall every detail retained the overall message. This narrative structure increased transmission accuracy over distance. Errors did occur, but the system corrected itself over time. Contradictions triggered reassessment. People adjusted their understanding incrementally. The absence of instant verification slowed correction, but did not prevent it. In many cases, gradual correction produced more stable outcomes than rapid reaction. Trust networks extended across generations. Families remembered which correspondence had been reliable. Guilds preserved reputations. Cities developed expectations about neighboring regions. This long-term memory created continuity. Communication did not reset with each generation. It accumulated. Even silence influenced belief. When expected news did not arrive, people noticed. This absence prompted questions and alternative explanations. Silence was interpreted as information, forcing communities to fill gaps cautiously. This awareness prevented complacency. Importantly, belief did not require certainty. People acted on probabilities. They adjusted plans based on the best available information, knowing it might change. This flexibility allowed society to function despite uncertainty. Communication supported adaptation rather than prediction. The absence of newspapers did not mean confusion. It meant participation. Everyone contributed to evaluation by listening, remembering, comparing, and deciding what to repeat. Communication was not consumed, it was co-created. As we move forward, we will examine how these human systems adapted when early print began to appear and why newspapers succeeded only because these foundations already existed. Living without newspapers did more than shape how information moved. It shaped how people thought. Communication systems influence perception, patience, social behavior, and expectations. In pre-newspaper Europe, the way news traveled deeply affected how people understood time, distance, certainty, and community. Information was not instant, not uniform, and not overwhelming in the modern sense. Instead, it arrived gradually, unevenly, and socially. This environment cultivated a distinct mental framework, one that balanced uncertainty with continuity and collective awareness with personal judgment. One of the most profound effects was the perception of time. Without daily headlines, time was not segmented into news cycles. Events unfolded over weeks, months, or even years in public consciousness. People did not expect immediate updates. They expected accumulation. Understanding developed slowly as reports layered upon one another. This fostered patience. Change was interpreted as a process rather than a sequence of isolated moments. This temporal mindset influenced reactions. Sudden events did not demand instant conclusions. People waited to hear more. Early reports were treated cautiously. Emotional responses were moderated by uncertainty. This did not mean people were indifferent. It meant they were adaptive. They understood that initial information was incomplete and that meaning would emerge over time. Distance was also perceived differently. Without precise maps or instant verification, distance was experiential rather than numerical. People understood places through stories, routes, and travel time. News from far away carried a sense of journey. It was embedded in descriptions of roads, rivers, and encounters. This made distant events feel connected rather than abstract. Distance did not imply irrelevance, it implied effort. Because information arrived through people, it carried human context. News was rarely detached. It came with tone, emotion, and interpretation. Listeners learned not only what happened, but how it was experienced. This human framing encouraged empathy and imagination. People visualized events through narrative rather than data. Uncertainty was normalized. Without constant updates, people accepted that knowledge was provisional. This acceptance reduced anxiety over incomplete information. Instead of demanding certainty, people learned to function with probabilities. Decisions were made with awareness of potential revision. This flexibility was a survival skill in a world where conditions changed unpredictably. Crucially, this environment discouraged information overload. News competed with daily life rather than dominating it. People heard what mattered to them. Irrelevant information faded naturally. Attention was selective. This selectivity was not imposed. It emerged organically. Communication aligned with lived priorities. Social cohesion benefited from this structure. Because news was shared face-to-face, it reinforced relationships. Conversation created shared understanding. Even disagreement strengthened social bonds by encouraging discussion. Information exchange was participatory rather than passive. People felt involved in the construction of meaning. Communities developed collective narratives. Events were remembered together, discussed together, and integrated into shared memory. These narratives provided continuity across generations. History was not stored in archives alone. It lived in stories, customs, and expectations. This collective memory anchored identity. Authority was experienced relationally. Without centralized media, power communicated through presence, intermediaries, and reputation. People evaluated authority based on consistency and responsiveness. Trust was earned through interaction rather than asserted through publication. This created a dynamic relationship between rulers and communities. Importantly, this did not eliminate hierarchy. Inequalities existed, but information flowed across them more fluidly than we might assume. Servants, travelers, craftsmen, and merchants all participated in communication networks. Knowledge was not confined to elites. Awareness was distributed, even if influence was not. Conflict, when it arose, was processed communally. News of disputes spread gradually, allowing time for mediation and adaptation. Sudden escalation was less common because information did not arrive all at once. This slower pace sometimes reduced panic and rumor-driven reactions. Silence remained meaningful. Periods without news were noticed and interpreted. People paid attention to absence as much as presence. This attentiveness sharpened awareness. Communication was not taken for granted, it was observed. The lack of permanent records for everyday news also shaped memory. People remembered patterns rather than details. They recalled trends, reputations, and outcomes. This abstraction allowed understanding to persist without overwhelming specificity. Memory favored significance over volume. Education reinforced these habits. Learning emphasized listening, memorization, and discussion. These skills supported communication systems. People were trained, implicitly, to absorb information socially. Literacy added layers, but did not replace these foundations. Over time, this environment created resilience. Communication systems could absorb disruption. If one route failed, others remained. If one source proved unreliable, alternatives existed. Redundancy ensured continuity. This resilience was not engineered. It emerged from diversity and participation. Comparing this to modern media highlights what has changed and what has been lost. Speed has increased, but patience has diminished. Volume has grown, but selectivity has weakened. Authority has centralized, but trust has fragmented. These contrasts remind us that communication systems shape not only knowledge, but behavior. Pre-newspaper Europe was not uninformed. It was differently informed. Its people were active participants in meaning-making. They did not consume news, they lived within it. Information was woven into daily experience rather than separated from it. As we approach the final chapters, we can now see the full architecture of this world. Movement, place, authority, correspondence, memory, trust, and perception working together. Newspapers did not replace this system, they transformed it. But understanding what came before allows us to appreciate the depth and sophistication of communication long before print dominated public life. When we look back at Europe before newspapers, the greatest mistake we can make is to measure that world using modern expectations. If we expect speed, instant awareness, synchronized reactions, and identical information everywhere, then pre-newspaper communication will always seem insufficient. But if we instead examine how people actually lived, moved, decided, and adapted, a very different picture emerges. Communication without newspapers was not a weaker version of modern media. It was a system designed, through practice, habit, and necessity, to function in a world shaped by distance, uncertainty, and human interaction. And when examined honestly, it reveals a level of depth, resilience, and effectiveness that is often underestimated. News in this world did not exist as a constant stream competing for attention. It existed as part of life itself. Information was woven into daily routines, social obligations, and practical decision-making. People did not separate news time from lifetime. A conversation while walking, a remark during work, a story shared over a meal. All of these were moments of communication. This integration meant that news was never abstract. It always arrived with context. Who said it, where it was heard, why it mattered, and how it might affect real choices. One of the most important characteristics of this system was that it trained people to think relationally rather than instantaneously. News was understood through connections. A report was not judged alone, but alongside previous reports, personal experience, and the reactions of others. Meaning emerged through accumulation. This process discouraged simplistic conclusions. People learned to hold multiple possibilities in mind, adjusting their understanding as new information arrived. Rather than reacting to isolated facts, they responded to evolving patterns. This pattern-based understanding created stability. Because information arrived gradually, it allowed time for interpretation and emotional regulation. Sudden shocks were rare not because events were less dramatic, but because awareness spread incrementally. By the time news reached many people, it had already passed through layers of explanation and comparison. This did not eliminate uncertainty, but it softened its impact. People were accustomed to uncertainty and therefore less destabilized by it. Another crucial feature was that communication remained grounded in accountability. Because information was shared face-to-face, or at least through identifiable intermediaries, speakers were socially visible. A person's reputation mattered. Persistent exaggeration or inaccuracy carried consequences. Over time, this created an informal but powerful system of quality control. Not perfect, but functional. Information did not float anonymously. It was attached to voices, bodies, and histories. This attachment also encouraged responsibility in listening. People did not passively absorb information. They evaluated it. They asked follow-up questions. They compared versions. They remembered not just content, but context. This active listening culture meant that audiences were not easily overwhelmed. Attention was selective and deliberate. People listened for what mattered to them and filtered the rest naturally. The absence of newspapers also meant the absence of uniform narratives. Europe did not experience events through a single framing. Different regions emphasized different aspects. A development might be understood economically in one place, politically in another, practically somewhere else. These perspectives coexisted rather than competing for dominance. Communication was plural rather than centralized. This plurality reduced the risk of total misinformation because no single version could completely replace others. Geography reinforced this diversity. Mountains, rivers, coastlines, and roads shaped not only movement but perception. People understood the world spatially, through routes and obstacles rather than through abstract maps. News carried a sense of terrain. Reports included descriptions of travel conditions, distances felt rather than measured, and time experienced rather than calculated. This embodied geography made information tangible. Events were not distant concepts. They were connected to known paths and familiar places. Memory played a stabilizing role in this environment. Because information was not constantly replaced by new updates, it remained active longer. People remembered stories, outcomes, and reputations. This long memory created continuity. Communities knew their own histories and compared present developments to past experiences. Communication was cumulative rather than disposable. This discouraged constant novelty and rewarded relevance. Importantly, this system also fostered a sense of shared responsibility for awareness. Knowing what was happening beyond one's immediate surroundings was not optional. It was part of being a functioning member of society. Asking travelers questions, listening at markets, sharing updates. These were social expectations. Communication was cooperative. No single person was responsible for being informed. Everyone contributed. This cooperative model extended across social layers. While access to influence was unequal, access to information was surprisingly broad. A laborer might hear news from a traveler. A craftsman might learn from a merchant. A servant might repeat information from a household. News crossed boundaries because it moved with people, not institutions. This mobility prevented complete isolation of any group. The system's adaptability was perhaps its greatest strength. It could absorb disruption without collapse. When roads were blocked, rivers carried information. When travel slowed, correspondence gained importance. When official announcements were delayed, informal exchange filled the gap. Communication adjusted organically, without requiring redesign. It evolved through use rather than planning. This adaptability also meant that communication could scale without breaking. As Europe became more interconnected through trade and movement, information networks expanded naturally. New routes created new channels. New contacts created new sources. The system did not need to be rebuilt, it extended itself. This is why early newspapers could later integrate so smoothly. They entered a structure already capable of handling expanded information flow. Another often overlooked aspect is emotional regulation. Because news was shared socially, emotional responses were moderated collectively. People reacted together, discussed concerns, and adjusted expectations. Fear did not spread instantly and uncontrollably. It spread slowly, giving time for reassurance, contradiction, and perspective. This did not eliminate anxiety, but it prevented constant escalation. Silence also retained meaning in this world. Periods without news were not ignored. They were noticed, discussed, and interpreted. People paid attention to absence as a signal. This attentiveness sharpened perception. Communication was not taken for granted. It was actively observed. The lack of permanent records for everyday events encouraged abstraction. People remembered what mattered most: outcomes, trends, reputations. This selective memory prevented overload and preserved significance. Not everything needed to be remembered, only what shaped future decisions. Communication served life rather than distracting from it. When newspapers eventually appeared, they succeeded because they respected these patterns. They did not instantly impose speed or volume. They adopted narrative forms, relied on existing distribution routes, and entered oral discussion rather than replacing it. Their authority grew gradually, not automatically. This demonstrates that pre-newspaper communication was not a primitive stage waiting to be corrected, but a mature system capable of integrating new tools. Seen in this light, the question is not how Europe survived without newspapers, but what kind of awareness that world cultivated. It cultivated patience rather than urgency, participation rather than consumption, judgment rather than reaction. Information was something people worked with, not something delivered to them finished and unquestioned. This chapter, then, is not an argument for nostalgia. It is an examination of how communication adapts to human conditions. Pre-newspaper Europe reminds us that news does not require paper, printing, or permanence to matter. It requires relevance, trust, memory, and social engagement. Those elements were present in abundance. As we approach the final chapter, the full picture becomes clear. Europe without newspapers was not silent, isolated, or uninformed. It was connected in a way that was slower but deeper, fragmented but resilient, uncertain but functional. Understanding this world allows us to see communication not as a product, but as a relationship, one shaped by people, movement, and time. To truly grasp how news spread across Europe without newspapers, we must finally let go of the idea that information exists independently of human behavior. In the world before print dominated communication, news was not an external force acting upon society. It was a social process that emerged from daily interaction. Information was inseparable from the rhythms of work, travel, conversation, and memory. People did not receive news in the modern sense. They encountered it, questioned it, absorbed it gradually, and reshaped it through use. This distinction is essential because it reveals that communication without newspapers was not simply slower. It was fundamentally different in structure, expectation, and purpose. In this environment, awareness developed horizontally rather than vertically. There was no single source from which knowledge flowed downward. Instead, information moved sideways, outward, and inward at the same time. Each person occupied a position within overlapping networks, contributing to and drawing from them simultaneously. A traveler carried stories forward, but also returned with new ones. A listener became a speaker. A recipient became a distributor. This constant role shifting ensured that communication remained dynamic rather than fixed. Because news was inseparable from people, it was inseparable from judgment. Every act of communication required evaluation. Was the speaker credible? Did the account align with what others had said? Did it make sense in light of known conditions? These questions were not abstract. They were practical. Acting on incorrect information could have real consequences. As a result, listening itself became a skill. People learned to weigh uncertainty, recognize exaggeration, and tolerate ambiguity. This cultivated a form of everyday critical thinking that did not rely on formal education or written verification. Time played a defining role in this process. Without daily updates, information matured slowly. Early reports were treated as provisional. People expected clarification over time. This expectation reduced the pressure to reach immediate conclusions. Understanding was not rushed. Instead, it accumulated. Each new piece of information adjusted the whole rather than replacing it. This incremental model of awareness fostered stability. Even when circumstances were uncertain, people felt oriented because they understood the broader trajectory of events. This slow maturation of knowledge also shaped emotional response. News did not arrive in overwhelming bursts. It arrived in fragments, spaced out by days or weeks. This spacing allowed emotion to settle. Fear, concern, or anticipation were discussed collectively rather than experienced in isolation. Conversation acted as a regulator. People shared reactions, challenged assumptions, and reassured one another. Emotional extremes were tempered by social presence. Information did not dominate inner life. It was integrated into communal experience. Another critical aspect of this system was its resistance to abstraction. Modern media often separates events from the people experiencing them. Pre-newspaper communication did the opposite. News arrived with human detail. It came through faces, voices, gestures, and stories of movement. Even distant events were described in terms of journeys, obstacles, and encounters. This grounded information in lived reality. People did not imagine the world as a collection of distant facts, but as an extension of familiar paths and relationships. Because communication was embodied, it also carried moral and social weight. Speaking was an act with consequences. Repeating information implied responsibility. People were aware that their words could influence decisions, behavior, and reputation. This awareness encouraged restraint. Silence was sometimes chosen deliberately. Not every piece of information needed to be shared immediately. Discretion was valued alongside openness. Communication was governed by judgment rather than impulse. The absence of newspapers also meant the absence of constant novelty. There was no expectation that something new had to happen every day. Attention was not fragmented by endless updates. Instead, people remained focused on ongoing situations. Issues unfolded over time, and understanding deepened rather than reset. This continuity allowed societies to track long-term patterns. Memory was not constantly overwritten. It was reinforced. This long memory shaped how communities understood cause and effect. People remembered how previous situations had developed. They compared present conditions with past outcomes. This historical awareness did not require formal records. It lived in shared recollection. Communication carried lessons forward. Knowledge was not merely descriptive, it was instructive. Crucially, this system was not fragile. It did not depend on a single medium or authority. It could survive disruption. When travel slowed, local exchange intensified. When correspondence failed, oral networks compensated. When official messages were delayed, informal communication filled the gap. Redundancy ensured continuity. Information did not vanish when one channel weakened. It rerouted. This resilience was possible because communication was distributed. No one controlled it entirely. Authority could influence it, but not monopolize it. This balance limited the impact of error from any single source. Mistakes occurred, but they were corrected through comparison and repetition. Over time, accuracy emerged not through enforcement, but through convergence. Participation was the system's foundation. Everyone played a role. Even those who traveled rarely contributed by listening, remembering, and sharing. Awareness was a collective achievement. This created a sense of shared responsibility. Being informed was not a private activity. It was a social one. When newspapers eventually appeared, they did not introduce awareness where none had existed. They entered a world already accustomed to evaluating, sharing, and contextualizing information. Print succeeded because it adapted to existing habits. It offered permanence and convenience, but it did not invent trust, relevance, or discussion. Those were already present. Seen clearly, the world before newspapers was not a preliminary stage waiting for improvement. It was a complete system suited to its conditions. It prioritized depth over speed, participation over consumption, and judgment over immediacy. Its limitations were real, but so were its strengths. Understanding this forces us to reconsider what news actually is. News is not paper. It is not print. It is not even speed. News is the shared process by which societies orient themselves in time and space. In pre-newspaper Europe, that process was alive, adaptive, and deeply human. This final chapter is therefore not only a conclusion to a historical question, but a reminder. Communication systems shape how people think, feel, and act. The absence of newspapers did not leave Europe in darkness. It produced a form of awareness that was slower, but often more grounded. Fragmented, but resilient. Uncertain, but participatory. As we come to the end of this long journey, one thing should now feel clear and almost self-evident. Europe did not wait for newspapers in order to understand itself. Long before ink standardized information, people had already built a living system of communication, one that relied on movement, memory, conversation, trust, and time. News was not delivered to society, it emerged from within it. In this world, awareness was not instant, but it was continuous. Information flowed at the speed of human life, not at the speed of machines. That pace shaped how people thought, how they reacted, and how they made decisions. Without constant updates, people learned patience. Without centralized narratives, they learned judgment. Without permanent records for everyday events, they learned to remember what truly mattered. Communication without newspapers required participation. People asked questions, listened carefully, compared accounts, and adjusted their understanding as new details arrived. Being informed was not passive. It was a shared responsibility. Every traveler, listener, messenger, and storyteller contributed to a collective sense of orientation in the world. This system was not perfect, but it was resilient. It could bend without breaking. It could absorb uncertainty without collapsing into confusion. It functioned because it matched human limits and human strengths. It respected attention. It valued relevance. It trusted conversation over volume. When newspapers finally appeared, they did not create awareness from nothing. They succeeded because this older system had already taught people how to evaluate information, how to discuss it, and how to live with uncertainty. Print did not replace human communication, it built upon it. Looking back, the question is no longer how news spread without newspapers, but what kind of awareness that world produced. It produced a slower awareness, but often a deeper one. A fragmented awareness, but a resilient one. An uncertain awareness, but a participatory one. News, in the end, was never just about information. It was about connection. And long before headlines and columns, Europe was already connected through voices, roads, letters, memories, and time. Thank you for staying with this story until the very end. If you found value in this calm exploration of the past, like the video, subscribe for more slow, thoughtful history, and leave a comment sharing what surprised you most.